3,000 years before unions existed, before the word strike had ever been spoken, before any law on earth recognized the dignity of a working man's labor. A group of sunburned, starving Egyptian craftsmen put down their chisels, walked away from the royal tombs they had devoted their entire lives to carving, and refused to return until they were fed. And before we go any further, if you are watching this and thinking, wait, I had no idea this happened, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss another story that the textbooks buried. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I genuinely want to know if this is reaching Cairo, London, Chicago, Lahore, or somewhere in between. And after you watch this all the way through, tell me in the comments, what should the next episode cover? Should we go deeper into the Egyptian New Kingdom? Should we follow the trail of the Sea Peoples who almost destroyed Bronze Age civilization? Should we cover the forgotten female pharaohs who ruled Egypt before anyone admitted they existed? Your votes decide what we build next. Now, let us go back 3,000 years to a valley of rock and heat and hunger, and meet the men who changed history without ever meaning to, long before any pharaoh carved his name into stone, long before the pyramids rose above the desert horizon. The Nile Valley was already alive with humanity. Tens of thousands of years before the first dynasty, bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers followed the great river's flooding rhythms, reading the land the way a scholar reads a book, tracking game, harvesting wild grain, fishing from reed boats in the shallows of what is now one of the world's most recognizable rivers. These were the Attyrian and Ibero-Mauritian peoples. And then the Neolithic farming communities who began to settle the delta and the valley around 5000 BCE, long before anyone had conceived of a god-king or a royal tomb. They planted emmer wheat and barley. They raised cattle and goats. They buried their dead with ochre and shells and small clay figurines that suggest they already believed in something beyond this world. These nameless, faceless ancestors of Egyptian civilization did something remarkable. They turned a hostile, flood-prone river valley into the most productive agricultural zone in the ancient world. And in doing so, they laid the physical and cultural foundation upon which one of history's greatest civilizations would eventually build itself. And yet, history forgot them almost entirely, because history prefers kings, and the kings who came after them were among the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived. Around 350 BCE, something unprecedented began to happen along the Nile. Small chieftains and regional warlords who had long competed over the valley's agricultural wealth began to consolidate power with a ferocity and speed that would define Egyptian political culture for 3,000 years. The land was divided, geographically and politically, into what Egyptians would later call the Two Lands. Upper Egypt in the south, where the river narrowed between sandstone cliffs and Lower Egypt in the north, where the Nile fanned out into the vast green delta before meeting the Mediterranean Sea. These two regions had distinct cultures, distinct gods, and distinct crowns: the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. And the man who unified them would become one of the most important figures in all of human history, though his story is still debated by scholars who cannot entirely agree on whether he was one person or two. His name was Narmer, and around 310 BCE, Narmer became the first pharaoh of a unified Egypt. The Narmer palette, a carved ceremonial slate discovered in the city of Hierakonpolis in 1898, shows him in the act of smiting an enemy with a mace, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, the first artistic depiction of a ruler claiming dominion over both lands. This single carved object, barely 2 feet tall, is one of the most important artifacts ever discovered, because it marks the precise moment when Egypt became Egypt, a unified political entity governed by a single divine king. The achievement of unification was staggering in its implications. Egypt now controlled the entire length of the Nile, from the first cataract in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north. A strip of agricultural land roughly 600 miles long, and in most places no more than a few miles wide, surrounded on both sides by absolute desert that served as a natural fortress wall against invasion. This geography would shape Egyptian civilization in ways that no other ancient culture experienced, because Egypt was, by the accident of its landscape, almost perfectly defended. The desert killed invaders before they could reach the river. The Nile fed the people who lived along it with a reliability that no other ancient agricultural system could match. The annual flood deposited a layer of rich black silt that made the soil so fertile that Egyptian farmers could grow crops with a minimum of the back-breaking irrigation labor that defined agriculture in Mesopotamia. This ease of production created surplus, and surplus created hierarchy, and hierarchy created the institution that would define Egypt for 3,000 years. The pharaoh, the living god, the embodiment of divine order in human form, the man whose power was so absolute that the very concept of challenging it would have seemed, to most Egyptians, as absurd as challenging the rising of the sun. The early pharaohs, the rulers of what Egyptologists call the first and second dynasties, began the project of building an administrative state with a speed and sophistication that still astonishes historians. They invented hieroglyphic writing not as an artistic flourish, but as a tool of governance, to record grain inventories, tax collections, labor conscriptions, and royal decrees across a territory that no single human being could personally administer. The third pharaoh of the first dynasty, who ruled around 3000 BCE, already commanded a bureaucratic apparatus capable of organizing and recording the labor of tens of thousands of people across hundreds of miles. At his tomb at Abydos, archaeologists discovered the remains of over 300 human servants who were buried alongside him, sacrificed, it appears, so that they could continue serving him in the afterlife, a practice that speaks volumes about the absolute nature of royal power in this earliest period. Egypt's first kings did not merely rule their people. They owned them, body and soul, in a way that would not be replicated in the ancient world until the great empires of Assyria and Persia appeared 2,000 years later. And yet, even in this era of near-total divine authority, there were already whispers, faint, barely audible whispers, of what happened when the state failed its people. With the consolidation of the early dynasties, the stage was cleared for one of the most dramatic building programs in human history. An era so grand, so physically overwhelming, that even today, standing at its remains, a human being cannot quite believe that other human beings built it without machines. It was during the Third Dynasty, around 2686 BCE, that Egypt entered the era that would make its name immortal. The pharaoh Djoser, advised by his brilliant architect and Chancellor Imhotep, commissioned the construction of a monument so revolutionary that it permanently altered the relationship between ruler and stone, between ambition and engineering, between a king and his eternity. The step pyramid at Saqqara, built around 2650 BCE, was the first large stone structure ever constructed in human history. Before Imhotep, monumental buildings were made of mud brick. Imhotep looked at the desert landscape, looked at the limestone cliffs flanking the Nile, and conceived of something that had never existed. A structure built entirely of carefully cut stone, stacked in 6 progressively smaller platforms to create a staircase reaching toward the sky. A literal architectural argument that the pharaoh was ascending to the heavens. The pyramid complex at Saqqara covered 60 acres and included not just the pyramid itself, but an entire ceremonial city of courts, chapels, and corridors, all enclosed within a towering perimeter wall nearly a mile in circumference. Djoser and Imhotep had not merely built a tomb. They had built a statement, a 3-dimensional declaration that Egypt's king was not a man, but a god, and that the gods built in stone because stone, unlike flesh, did not rot. The pyramid-building impulse, once unleashed, grew to proportions that defy easy description. Sneferu, the first pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty, who came to power around 2613 BCE, built not 1, not 2, but 3 major pyramids during his reign: the Maidam Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid at Dashur, and the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur. Each represented an experiment in structural engineering. Each pushed the boundaries of what Egyptian architects and workers understood about load distribution, angle of incline, and the behavior of limestone under enormous pressure. Sneferu's building program consumed an estimated 3.5 million tons of stone and required the labor of tens of thousands of workers over decades. And this was just the warm-up act, because Sneferu's son, the pharaoh Khufu, who came to power around 2589 BCE, commissioned the construction of a monument so massive that it remained the tallest human-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built over an estimated 20 years, stands 481 feet tall and contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. The precision of its construction is so extraordinary. Its base is level to within 2.1 centimeters. Its sides are aligned to true north with an error of less than 0.05 degrees. That it was not merely a feat of engineering, but a feat of scientific and mathematical understanding that would not be surpassed in the ancient world for 2,000 years. And every single one of those 2.3 million blocks was quarried, transported, dressed, and placed by human beings with copper tools, wooden sledges, and an organizational system of breathtaking complexity. For generations, popular imagination and a great deal of pseudoscientific nonsense insisted that the pyramids must have been built by slaves, because the idea that free human beings would voluntarily perform such brutal, exhausting, life-shortening labor seemed impossible. But archaeology demolished this myth decisively. In 1990, a construction worker accidentally uncovered a cemetery near the Giza Plateau that contained the remains of pyramid workers, not slaves buried in mass graves, but craftsmen and laborers buried with care, with beer jars and bread loaves for the afterlife, with small inscribed stones identifying their names and their teams. Hieroglyphic graffiti found inside the pyramid itself, left by the work gangs during construction, reveals team names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkora, suggesting a degree of group identity, even humor, that does not fit the image of broken, coerced slaves. Records discovered at a site called Wadi al-Jarf, the world's oldest known papyri, dating to around 2560 BCE, and discovered only in 2013, describe in meticulous detail the daily lives of a team of 40 men led by an inspector named Murr, who transported limestone blocks by boat from Tura to Giza. Murr's men received rations of bread, beer, and meat. They worked in rotating shifts. They rested. They were, by the standards of their time, reasonably well compensated for their labor. The pyramid builders were not slaves. They were workers, skilled, organized, and dependent on the state for their survival. And this distinction, seemingly minor, would become the most explosive political fault line in Egyptian history 3,000 years later. The Old Kingdom reached its absolute cultural and political peak under the Fourth Dynasty pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkora, whose pyramids at Giza represent a level of royal ambition and state organizational capacity that Egypt would never quite replicate again. Khafre, who built the second pyramid at Giza around 2532 BCE, also commissioned the Great Sphinx, a monument 240 feet long and 66 feet tall, carved directly from a natural limestone outcrop in the Giza Plateau. Its face believed by most Egyptologists to bear Khafre's own features, gazing eternally eastward toward the rising sun. The Sphinx was not decoration. It was theology made stone, a guardian, a god, a statement that the pharaoh's divine protection extended even over the desert itself, even over time itself, even over the darkness that followed every sunset. The Fourth Dynasty's artistic achievements were equally extraordinary. The painted limestone busts, the exquisite carved reliefs in tomb chapels, the mathematical precision of hieroglyphic inscriptions that recorded not just royal deeds, but the names and titles, and sometimes even the personalities of the officials who served beneath the pharaoh. Egypt in the age of the Old Kingdom, pyramids, was not merely powerful. It was one of the most culturally sophisticated civilizations that had ever existed, and its certainty about its own greatness was absolute. Then, from the south and the interior, a force that no pharaoh had built a pyramid large enough to contain arrived, not as an army, but as a whisper, a drying wind, a slow, catastrophic failure of the one thing Egypt's entire civilization depended upon. The Nile stopped flooding reliably. Beginning around 220 BCE, a prolonged drought affected the entire eastern Mediterranean and northeast Africa, reducing the Nile's annual inundation to a fraction of its normal level. Without the flood, there was no silt. Without the silt, there were no crops. Without crops, there was no grain. Without grain, the pyramid building ceased immediately, and the elaborate system of state redistribution, the grain stores, the ration records, the workers' villages, the entire logistical infrastructure of pharaonic civilization, collapsed with a speed that stunned the Egyptians themselves. The Sixth Dynasty, Pharaoh Pepi II, who had reportedly reigned for an extraordinary 94 years, died around 2184 BCE, leaving behind a state so weakened that within a generation, Egypt fragmented into competing regional powers for the first time since Narmer. The Old Kingdom did not fall to an invading army. It starved to death, and in the chaos that followed, regional governors called nomarchs seized the power that the pharaoh could no longer maintain, and Egypt shattered into a dozen competing principalities that would spend the next century and a half fighting each other for supremacy. And somewhere in those chaotic, hungry years, an idea took root in the Egyptian imagination. One that no official ideology would ever dare speak aloud. The pharaoh was divine, yes, but even gods could fail their people. And a people who were starving were a people with nothing left to lose. With the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the stage was cleared for a period of darkness, experimentation, and eventually, remarkably, rebirth from the wreckage of the first intermediate period. A new dynasty would emerge from the south and reunite Egypt with a ferocity born of long humiliation. It was at this moment that a warrior king from the southern city of Thebes named Mentuhotep II did what no Egyptian had done since Narmer. He conquered the north, defeated his rivals, and reunified the two lands under a single crown around 2055 BCE. After a military campaign that lasted years and culminated in what appears to have been a brutal siege and sack of the northern city of Heracleopolis, Mentuhotep II declared himself king of all Egypt and launched the era that Egyptologists call the Middle Kingdom. He was celebrated in later Egyptian tradition as one of the greatest pharaohs who ever lived, placed in lists alongside Menes and Rameses as one of the founders of Egyptian civilization. And his achievement was genuinely extraordinary. He rebuilt the administrative apparatus of the state, reorganized the army, restoring the borders of Egypt's territorial influence in Nubia and Sinai, and commissioned ambitious building projects at Thebes that would establish that southern city as the spiritual heart of Egyptian civilization for the next 1,000 years. But Mentuhotep II's most lasting legacy was subtler than pyramids or military campaigns. He changed the ideological relationship between the pharaoh and the people. The trauma of the first intermediate period, the famine, the fragmentation, the humiliating sight of competing warlords claiming divine kingship while the common people starved, had left a permanent mark on the Egyptian cultural imagination. The literature of the Middle Kingdom reflects this trauma with a directness and emotional complexity that the Old Kingdom had never allowed. The dialogue of a man who contemplates suicide with his soul, composed sometime during or just after the first intermediate period, is one of the earliest pieces of philosophical literature in human history. A text in which a man, overwhelmed by the chaos of his world, argues with his own soul about whether life is worth living. The Lamentations of Ipuwer describes, in language of extraordinary vividness, a society in total collapse, the Nile running red, servants wearing jewels while their masters go hungry, the poor becoming rich, and the rich becoming nothing, tombs robbed, and bodies lying in the streets. This was not the triumphalist literature of the Old Kingdom, where every text proclaimed the pharaoh's eternal glory. This was a civilization processing grief, trying to understand how something as solid and inevitable as the divine order could have cracked so completely, and wondering what it meant for the future. Middle Kingdom pharaohs responded to this cultural anxiety, not just with military power, but with a new kind of royal ideology, one that emphasized the pharaoh's duty of care toward his people, his role as shepherd rather than merely as god, his obligation to ensure that the grain stores were full and that justice prevailed in the courts. The shift was subtle, but it was real, and it planted a seed in Egyptian political consciousness that would one day 3,000 years after Narmer, 1,000 years after the Middle Kingdom itself, bloom into something nobody in the ancient world had ever seen. The 12th dynasty, which began with the pharaoh Amenemhat, around 1985 BCE, represented the political and cultural high-water mark of the Middle Kingdom. Amenemhat was himself a man of non-royal origin. His mother appears to have been a Nubian woman, and he almost certainly rose to power through military and administrative ability rather than royal birth. And he ruled with a pragmatism and sophistication that distinguished him from the god kings of the Old Kingdom. He moved the capital from Thebes to a new city called Ichtoi, positioned strategically between Upper and Lower Egypt to allow better administrative control over both regions. He reorganized the bureaucracy, introduced new systems of taxation and grain accounting, and launched a propaganda campaign of extraordinary subtlety, commissioning literary texts that presented his rise to power as divinely ordained, while simultaneously acknowledging that previous rulers had failed and that Egypt needed new leadership. The Prophecy of Nefertiti, a text supposedly written in the time of the Old Kingdom, but actually composed during Amenemhat's reign, predicted the arrival of a king named Ameni, who would reunify Egypt and restore order. A barely disguised piece of political literature that used the authority of the past to legitimize the present. Amenemhat understood something that many ancient rulers never grasped: that propaganda works best when it disguises itself as history. The artistic achievements of the 12th dynasty were breathtaking in their sophistication. The literary compositions of this era, the story of Xiongnu, the eloquent peasant, the instructions of Amenemhat, represent the highest point of ancient Egyptian literature. Texts of such psychological complexity and narrative skill that they remained canonical reading material for Egyptian scribal students for over 1,000 years after they were written. The story of Xiongnu in particular, the tale of an Egyptian official who flees the country after the assassination of Amenemhat I, spends decades as a celebrated warrior and chieftain in Syria-Palestine, and eventually returns to Egypt to die in his homeland, reads with a vividness and emotional resonance that feels startlingly modern. Xiongnu's longing for Egypt, his pride in Egyptian culture, his eventual return to the land of his birth, and his reception by the pharaoh himself. These are not the stiff, formal emotions of official propaganda, but the recognizable feelings of a real human being caught between worlds. The Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom were not just building pyramids and carving reliefs. They were inventing literature, and they were doing it with a sophistication that no other ancient civilization would match for centuries. However, the Middle Kingdom, for all its cultural brilliance, carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. The later 12th and 13th dynasty pharaohs ruled over an Egypt that was growing increasingly cosmopolitan. Merchants, migrants, and soldiers from the Levant from Nubia, from the Aegean were settling in the Nile Delta in growing numbers, bringing their gods, their languages, their customs, and their political ambitions with them. The administrative machinery of the state, brilliant as it was, struggled to process this demographic complexity. And when a series of weak pharaohs succeeded each other in rapid succession during the 13th dynasty, some reigning for barely a year or two before being replaced, the state began to fracture along the same fault lines that had destroyed the old kingdom. Then, from the northeast, came a threat that no amount of administrative sophistication could manage. The Hyksos, a Semitic-speaking people from the Levant, whose name in Egyptian meant something like rulers of foreign lands, had been migrating into the Nile Delta for generations, settling peacefully at first, then in growing numbers, then with sufficient military force to simply take the northern part of Egypt and establish their own kingdom. Around 1650 BCE, the Hyksos king Saulitis seized the ancient city of Memphis and declared himself pharaoh of Lower Egypt, sending a shockwave of humiliation through the Egyptian ruling class in the south that would not be fully processed for generations. Egypt had been invaded, conquered in part, at least, by people the Egyptians considered barbarians, people who worshipped the wrong gods and spoke the wrong languages, and did not observe the correct rituals. The second intermediate period that followed a century and a half of divided Egypt, Hyksos kings in the north, Egyptian pharaohs in the south, Nubian kingdoms pressing from below, was the deepest trauma Egyptian national identity had ever suffered, and it produced, by reaction, the most aggressive, most militarized, most empire-building dynasty in Egyptian history. This instability continued until, from Thebes, a family of warrior kings rose who would not merely expel the Hyksos, but chase them back to their homelands and build an empire that stretched from the Sudan to the Euphrates, and whose craftsmen, paid in grain and given privileged status, would one day put down their tools and change the world. The man who expelled the Hyksos and launched the new kingdom was Amos I, a Theban prince who came to power around 1550 BCE and spent the first years of his reign in a military campaign of extraordinary ferocity, using the bronze weapons and horse-drawn chariots that the Hyksos had introduced to Egypt, military technologies that the Egyptians had rapidly adopted and mastered. Amos drove the Hyksos out of Memphis, out of their capital Avaris in the Delta, and north into Canaan, pursuing them all the way to the fortress city of Sharuhin in what is now southern Israel, which he besieged for 3 years before it fell. The expulsion of the Hyksos was not simply a military event, it was a cultural earthquake, a national psychological revival, a moment when Egypt collectively decided that it would never again allow a foreign power to control its territory, and that the best way to ensure this was to project Egyptian military power outward, to create a buffer of conquered territories and client kingdoms so wide and deep that no foreign army could ever again reach the Nile Valley. Ahmose, I did not merely liberate Egypt. He launched the ideology of empire, and the empire that his successors built would be one of the most remarkable political structures of the ancient world. The new kingdom pharaohs Thutmose I, the extraordinary Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, the revolutionary Akhenaten, Tutankhamun I, Hormheb, and then the great Ramessid dynasty, ruled Egypt at the height of its power, wealth, and cultural sophistication for nearly 500 years. Thutmose I, who came to power around 1506 BCE, pushed Egyptian armies further than any pharaoh before him, north into Syria, south into Nubia, establishing an empire that ran from the Fourth Nile Cataract in the south to the Euphrates River in the north, a territorial extent that would never be surpassed in Egyptian history. His grandson, Thutmose III, arguably the greatest military commander in Egyptian history, sometimes called the Napoleon of Egypt, fought 17 military campaigns in the Levant during his 54-year reign, defeating a coalition of Canaanite city-states at the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE in a tactical masterstroke that ancient military historians considered one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the ancient world. Thutmose III did not fight Megiddo, he outthought it. His generals advised him to take a longer, safer route to the battlefield. Thutmose chose instead to march his army through the narrow Aruna Pass, a route so tight that the army had to pass in single file for miles, completely vulnerable to attack from the heights above, because he calculated that his enemy would consider this route too dangerous and would not defend it. He was right. His army emerged onto the plain of Megiddo, while the enemy coalition, camped outside the city walls, scrambled in confusion, and the battle was won before it fully began. At least 330 city-states, from Canaan to Mesopotamia, sent tribute to Thutmose III annually. Gold, silver, copper, horses, cattle, lapis lazuli, cedar wood, and human beings in numbers that filled the granaries and treasuries of Thebes to overflowing. But it was not the military campaigns that defined the new kingdom's cultural achievement. It was what the wealth of empire made possible, and the extraordinary individuals, both royal and non-royal, who used that wealth to create things that would survive for 3,000 years. Amenhotep III, who ruled from around 1388 to 1350 BCE, presided over perhaps the most spectacular period of artistic and architectural production in Egyptian history. His reign saw the construction of the Colossi of Memnon, two enormous seated statues of the pharaoh himself, each 60 feet tall, that once flanked the entrance to his mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes. His wife, the great royal wife Tang, a woman of non-royal origin from a provincial Egyptian family, whose father was a military officer named Yuya, wielded political influence that Greek and Canaanite correspondence of the period makes clear was not merely ceremonial. Foreign kings wrote letters directly to Tang, seeking her intervention with her husband, a practice that was extraordinary in a world where women rarely held acknowledged political power. Amenhotep III's Egypt was a civilization at the absolute peak of its confidence, a place where foreign gold flowed in as tribute, where artists painted tomb walls with images of pleasure and abundance that still take the breath away 3,000 years later, where the pharaoh was so secure in his divine authority that he could commission portraits of himself that were almost abstract in their stylization. The human face so idealized as to become something not quite human at all. Then, from within the royal house itself, came the single most bizarre and disruptive episode in 3,000 years of Egyptian religious history. An episode so radical that it still has scholars arguing about its causes, its meaning, and its lasting effects. Amenhotep IV, who succeeded his father around 1353 BCE, looked at 3,000 years of Egyptian religion, the vast, complex, beautifully organized pantheon of hundreds of gods, each with their temples, their priests, their festivals, their sacred animals, and their sacred texts, and declared it all invalid. He renamed himself Akhenaten, moved the capital of Egypt to a brand new city he built from scratch in the middle of the desert at a site now called Amarna, and declared that there was only one God, the Aten, the solar disk, whose light gave life to all creation. The temples of Amun and the other traditional gods were closed. Their statues were defaced. Their names were chiseled from inscriptions wherever they appeared. The thousands of priests who had served the traditional cults were dispossessed. For 17 years, Akhenaten ruled Egypt in what amounted to a religious revolution imposed by royal decree. And then he died, and within a generation, everything he had done was undone with equal ferocity. His city was abandoned, his temples demolished, his images destroyed, his name chiseled from every inscription by successors who referred to him only as the criminal of Amarna. The traditional gods returned. The priests of Amun reclaimed their wealth and power, and a young king named Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's son, or younger brother, who died around 1323 BCE at approximately 18 years of age, whose fame today rests entirely on the accident that his tomb was not robbed in antiquity and was discovered intact in 1922 by the archaeologist Howard Carter, became the symbol of restoration, of the return to normalcy, of everything Akhenaten had tried and failed to destroy. The Amarna period is one of the great enigmas of Egyptian history. Was Akhenaten a genuine religious visionary, a political revolutionary trying to break the power of the priestly class, a man suffering from some physical or psychological condition that distorted his perception of reality? 3,000 years later, the question remains genuinely open, which is perhaps the most astonishing thing about it. It was at this moment that the new kingdom entered its final, most dramatic phase, the Ramessid era, named for the series of pharaohs who bore the name Rameses, and dominated above all by the man who called himself Rameses the Great, the pharaoh Rameses II, who ruled Egypt for 67 years, beginning around 1279 BCE, and whose inscriptions covered so many temple walls with descriptions of his victories that later Egyptologists found it difficult to distinguish his genuine achievements from his extraordinary gifts for self-promotion. Rameses II fought the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE against the Hittite king Muwatalli II, a battle that resulted, by most military historical analysis, in something close to a draw, with both sides suffering heavy casualties and neither achieving a decisive victory, and then spent the next 50 years describing it in temple inscriptions, poems, and official documents as one of the greatest personal triumphs in military history. The story of Kadesh, as Rameses told it, had him abandoned by his fleeing army, surrounded by enemy chariots, and single-handedly turning the battle through his own divine courage and the intervention of the god Amun. A narrative so dramatic, so cinematically compelling, so obviously constructed to glorify the pharaoh, that it was reproduced on temple walls from Abu Simbel in Nubia to Pi-Rameses in the Delta. Rameses II understood something that very few ancient rulers grasped with such clarity, that the story of a battle was often more politically important than its actual outcome. He was not merely a warrior, he was history's first great propagandist, and the monuments he built to commemorate his real and imagined victories, Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, the additions to Karnak and Luxor, the dedication of the enormous new capital city Pi-Rameses in the Delta, were the physical expression of an ego so enormous and a reign so long that they reshaped the Egyptian landscape permanently. But beneath the granite surface of Ramesid glory, something was quietly going wrong. The empire that Thutmose III had built was contracting. The Hittites had taken Syria. The Levantan city-states were growing more assertive. The flow of tribute that had funded the extraordinary wealth of the new kingdom was slowing. Rameses II's successors, Meremptah, Seti II, Amenmes, Siptah, Tosret, the confused succession of weak rulers who followed, faced a world that was growing more unstable by the decade, a world in which the sea peoples, mysterious groups of migrants and raiders from the Aegean and Anatolia, were destroying Bronze Age civilization across the eastern Mediterranean with an efficiency and violence that no ancient state seemed able to resist. Troy fell, Mycenae fell, Ugarit fell. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's greatest rival, simply ceased to exist around 1180 BCE. Its capital Hattusa burned to the ground by people whose identity historians still debate. the Bronze Age collapsed, and Egypt, uniquely among the great powers of the late second millennium, survived, though barely and at enormous cost. The pharaoh Ramesses III, who came to power around 1184 BCE, and was the last great ruler of Egyptian history before the long, slow decline of the New Kingdom, fought off multiple invasions of the Sea Peoples in a series of battles that he recorded in magnificent painted reliefs at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Reliefs that are among the most vivid battle scenes in all of ancient art, showing Egyptian archers and foot soldiers in chaotic, realistic combat with enemies whose distinctive feathered headdresses and strange ships identified them as people from another world. Ramesses III stopped the Sea Peoples at the border. He preserved Egypt's territorial integrity. He kept the Nile Valley from suffering the catastrophic destruction that had swept away every other Bronze Age civilization in the region. And then, with exquisite historical irony, he was murdered. The harem conspiracy of 1155 BCE, documented in surviving court records of extraordinary detail, reveals that a group of officials, including several members of the royal harem and at least one high-ranking courtier, plotted to assassinate Ramesses III and replace him with one of his minor sons. CT scans conducted on his mummy in 2012 revealed that his throat had been cut so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. The conspiracy failed to place its chosen candidate on the throne, but it succeeded in ending the life of the man who had saved Egypt from the Sea Peoples, killed not by foreign invaders, but by people inside his own palace, people within the system, people who had decided that the pharaoh's absolute authority was a problem that could be solved with a knife. It is impossible to understand what happened next, the event that is the true subject of this entire story, without understanding the world that produced it. And that world was the world of Deir el-Medina, the most extraordinary village in the ancient world. From the very beginning of the New Kingdom, the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty made a decision that would have profound consequences for the next 5 centuries of Egyptian history. They abandoned the pyramid as a royal burial monument. The pyramids of the Old and Middle Kingdoms had been monumental advertisements for the location of the pharaoh's burial. Enormous, impossible-to-miss structures that had attracted robbers as reliably as they had attracted religious devotion. By the New Kingdom, virtually every royal pyramid from the Old Kingdom had been robbed, some within decades of the pharaoh's death. The treasures that were supposed to support the pharaoh's eternal afterlife long since stripped and melted down. So the New Kingdom pharaohs chose instead to hide their tombs, to cut them deep into the limestone cliffs of a remote valley on the west bank of the Nile opposite Thebes. A valley so isolated, so difficult to access, so thoroughly surrounded by natural barriers of rock and desert that it seemed to the officials who chose it around 1500 BCE to be the perfect secret. They called it Ta Sedat, the Great Place. We call it the Valley of the Kings. And the construction, decoration, and maintenance of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, royal tombs, queens' tombs, tombs of nobles and officials, required the creation of something that had never existed before in any civilization, a permanent, government-funded community of artists and craftsmen who lived their entire lives in service of the royal burial program. That community was Deir el-Medina, built on the west bank of Thebes around 1550 BCE. Deir el-Medina was a walled village housing the families of the craftsmen who worked in the Valley of the Kings, the artists who painted the tomb walls, the sculptors who carved the reliefs, the plasterers and draftsmen and scribes who planned and executed some of the most elaborate funerary art in human history. At its peak during the Ramesside period, the village housed roughly 60 to 100 households, perhaps 400 to 500 people in total, living in a community so tightly organized and so extensively documented that historians today know more about the daily lives of the people of Deir el-Medina than about almost any other community in the ancient world before the modern era. They know this because the people of Deir el-Medina wrote things down. Everything, obsessively, habitually, almost compulsively. They recorded the details of their lives on ostraca, fragments of limestone flake and pottery shard that were cheap and plentiful in the desert environment of the West Bank, leaving behind tens of thousands of texts covering work records, legal disputes, love letters, medical recipes, ghost stories, erotic poetry, financial transactions, property disputes, absenteeism records, complaints about neighbors, and crucially, administrative records of the state's obligation to supply the village with its rations. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina were not paid wages in the modern sense. They were paid in kind. Monthly rations of grain, oil, fish, vegetables, salt, pottery, and occasionally luxury goods like natron and wood, delivered by the state's administrative apparatus and supplemented by additional payments for specific tasks. Their livelihood was entirely dependent on the reliability of the state's delivery system. When the grain came, they worked. When it did not come, they had nothing. The social world of Deir el-Medina was extraordinarily rich. The villagers were organized into two gangs, the right side gang and the left side gang, each responsible for one side of the tomb being cut into the limestone, led by foremen who held positions of considerable authority and who served as intermediaries between the workers and the state administration. The scribes of the village kept meticulous attendance records, noting each day which workers were present and which were absent, and remarkably, recording the reasons for absence with a frankness that makes the documents feel contemporary. His wife is sick, brewing beer, fetching stone, stung by a scorpion, making offerings to his god. and with disarming honesty. His eyes are sore, appears repeatedly as a reason for absence that was apparently accepted without question. The villagers conducted a thriving local economy among themselves, trading goods and services in elaborate informal markets, documented in hundreds of ostraca price lists. They litigated their disputes before a local court called the Kenbit, whose records survive in sufficient number to reconstruct not just the legal principles they applied, but the personalities of individual disputants across generations. A man named Mena cheated his neighbor Nebnefer out of a goat. A woman named Nonaket disinherited several of her children because they had failed to care for her in old age. A draftsman named Amenaket conducted an extended legal battle over the ownership of a tomb with a persistence and ingenuity that consumed years of community attention. These were not abstractions. These were people, specific, individual, fully realized human beings, living their lives with the same mixture of mundane practicality, passionate feeling, sharp intelligence, and occasional pettiness that characterizes human communities in every era and every culture. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina were also, by the standards of their time and society, relatively privileged. They were literate at a rate far above the general Egyptian population. Perhaps half or more of the male villagers could read and write, in a society where literacy was normally the exclusive possession of the scribal and priestly classes. They held government-funded jobs that guaranteed them stable income, comfortable, by ancient standards, housing in the village, and the social prestige that came from working on the most sacred construction project in the Egyptian world, the preparation of the pharaoh's eternal dwelling. Their sons inherited their positions. Their daughters were literate. Their women owned property, conducted legal transactions, and appear in the village records as active, assertive participants in community life in a way that distinguishes Deir el-Medina from almost every other ancient community we know about. The tomb paintings they created, the exquisite, color-saturated images of the afterlife that cover the walls of the royal and noble tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the nearby Valley of the Queens, represent the highest achievement of New Kingdom art. Images of such technical precision and emotional power that they have been drawing visitors from around the world for over 200 years and show no signs of losing their capacity to astonish. The artists of Deir el-Medina were, in every meaningful sense, the finest craftsmen in Egypt, in a civilization that was the finest in the world, doing work that they knew would outlast every living thing for miles in every direction, and they were being starved by the government they served. The records of Deir el-Medina in the reign of Ramesses III and his successors reveal, with painful clarity, a system in progressive administrative collapse. The monthly grain deliveries, the fundamental payment that the state owed its workers in exchange for their labor on the royal tombs, began arriving late. then very late, then not arriving at all for months at a stretch. The ostraca record the escalating desperation of the village scribes, who sent message after message to the state granaries demanding the overdue rations, whose pleas went unanswered or were met with bureaucratic excuses, who watched the village's grain stores dwindle while the administrative system that was supposed to replenish them simply failed to function. The reasons for this failure were multiple and systemic. The contraction of the empire had reduced the flow of tribute that funded the state's ration system. The increasing weakness of the later Ramessid pharaohs meant that the administrative machinery lacked the strong royal direction it needed to function efficiently. And most damningly, there appears to have been significant corruption among the officials responsible for delivering the rations. Men who were diverting grain intended for the workers into their own stores, while reporting the deliveries as complete. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina were being robbed. They knew it, and they could prove it because they were literate and they kept records. But knowing you are being robbed and having any mechanism to do anything about it were, in the ancient world, two entirely different things. Until the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, when a group of hungry craftsmen decided to invent a mechanism that had never existed before. The Turin Strike Papyrus is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of the ancient world, discovered in the 19th century and now housed in the Museo Egizio in Turin, Italy. This papyrus, roughly 45 centimeters long and written on both sides in the practiced administrative hand of a village scribe, records in meticulous, almost journalistic detail the events of what Egyptologists call the strike of year 29. The 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, which corresponds to approximately 1155 BCE. It is the oldest known written record of a labor strike in all of human history, and reading it across the gulf of 3,000 years produces a sensation that is difficult to describe. A feeling of recognition, of familiarity, of the sudden collapse of distance between the ancient world and our own. Because the complaints of the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina are complaints that any worker in any century would immediately recognize. They had not been paid. They had waited as long as they could. They were hungry, and they had decided that enough was enough. The background to the strike had been building for months, possibly for years. Surviving administrative records from the period immediately preceding year 29 show repeated gaps in the grain deliveries to Deir el-Medina. Sometimes a few days late, sometimes weeks late, sometimes rations that arrived incomplete or of inferior quality to what was contractually owed. The village scribes had been filing formal complaints through official channels, sending written requests to the vizier's office, to the granary administrators, to the temple officials who managed the rations from the mortuary temples on the West Bank. and receiving either no response or inadequate explanations. By the time the events recorded in the Turin strike papyrus began to unfold, the workers of Deir el-Medina had gone 18 days without receiving their monthly grain ration. 18 days in a community with no independent source of food, no private agricultural land, no ability to go elsewhere for employment. This was not an inconvenience or an administrative delay. This was starvation approaching by the day, and the foreman of the left side gang, a man named Khans, made a decision that nobody in Egyptian history had ever made before. He led his men out of the Valley of the Kings. They did not go home. They did not simply refuse to work. They went instead to the walls of the mortuary temples on the West Bank. The temples of Thutmose III, of Ramesses II, of Seti I, and they sat down outside the walls and refused to leave. The papyrus records their words with stark directness. We are hungry and thirsty. We have no clothing, no ointment, no fish, no vegetables. Write to our lord the Pharaoh about it, and write to our lord the vizier in whose charge we are, so that the means of living may be given to us. This was not rebellion. The craftsmen were careful, in the language they used, to remain within the framework of the existing social order. They did not challenge the pharaoh's authority. They did not claim rights that Egyptian law did not recognize. They did not demand a change in the political system. They demanded what was owed to them: their contractual entitlement, their legitimate payment for work performed, the grain that the state had promised them and failed to deliver. But the act of leaving the workplace and staging a public demonstration at the walls of the mortuary temples, in full view of the priests, the officials, and the administrative staff of the West Bank, was an act without precedent in Egyptian history. It was, in the most literal sense, the first strike ever recorded, and the officials who came out to deal with it had no established protocol for handling it, because nothing like it had ever happened before. The temple officials were initially at a loss. They met with the workers, heard their complaints, acknowledged the validity of the ration shortfall, and promised to look into the matter, while almost certainly hoping that the craftsmen would eventually get bored or frightened and return to work. The craftsmen did not return to work. The papyrus records a scene of striking, forgive the pun, administrative chaos, officials rushing back and forth between the workers outside the wall and their superiors inside, messages being dispatched to the vizier's office in Thebes, emergency distributions of rations being scraped together from whatever resources were immediately available. On the first day of the strike, the workers received 50 sacks of emmer wheat, enough to tide them over for a few days, and returned to the village. But the underlying problem had not been solved, and within days, they were back. The papyrus records a second sit-down, this time at the temple of Ramesses II itself, the Ramesseum, one of the most sacred and impressive structures on the West Bank, where the workers pushed past the gate and occupied the temple complex itself, staging their demonstration within the very walls of a monument to the greatest of the Ramessid pharaohs. The symbolism was almost certainly intentional. They were not just demanding grain. They were staging their protest in a location that made it impossible for the officials to pretend it wasn't happening. In a place whose association with royal power and divine authority made their presence there a statement of enormous cultural weight. The Foreman Khans, whose voice and personality emerge from the papyrus with remarkable clarity across 3,000 years, navigated the crisis with a combination of calculated boldness and careful political management. He maintained the workers' collective solidarity, keeping them together, preventing the officials from picking off individual complainants through promises or threats, while simultaneously engaging the administrative apparatus through official channels, submitting formal written complaints rather than merely shouting demands. He understood, intuitively or through long experience with the Egyptian bureaucracy, that the workers' strongest weapons were their indispensability and their documentation. The royal tombs could not be completed without them. Every day that the craftsmen sat outside the temple walls was a day that the sacred work of preparing the pharaoh's eternal dwelling was not being done. A dereliction that reflected badly not just on the workers themselves, but on the officials responsible for managing them, and ultimately on the pharaoh, whose divine mandate was supposed to ensure that the sacred work proceeded smoothly. The strike was not just an economic action, it was a political statement, a public demonstration that the administrative system had failed, that the officials responsible for delivering the rations had not done their jobs, and that the pharaoh's divine order, the Mot, the cosmic principle of justice and balance that every pharaoh was supposed to embody and maintain, had been violated by the corruption and negligence of his own officials. The resolution of the strike of year 29 was characteristically Egyptian in its pragmatism and its ultimate inadequacy. The vizier's office eventually arranged for emergency ration deliveries that partially satisfied the immediate demands of the workers. They received some of their overdue grain, enough fish and vegetables to quiet the most urgent hunger, and what appear to have been promises of more regular delivery in the future. The workers returned to the Valley of the Kings and resumed work on the royal tombs. Nobody was punished for the strike, not the workers who had staged it, not the foreman who had led it, not the officials whose corruption or negligence had caused it. The Turin strike papyrus records the resolution with the same matter-of-fact administrative precision with which it records the strike itself, as if the scribe who wrote it was simply noting a logistical problem that had been temporarily solved rather than documenting a world historical event. And this, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing about the strike of year 29. Not just that it happened, but that it worked. The workers of Deir el-Medina staged the first recorded labor strike in human history, and they won. Not completely, not permanently, not in a way that changed the structural conditions that had produced the crisis. But they put down their tools, held their ground, spoke their demands in public, and the state gave them something in return. That is, by any definition, a successful strike. But the story did not end there. Because the grain deliveries continued to be unreliable, and the workers continued to strike, the papyri and ostraca from the reigns of Ramesses III's successors, Ramesses IV, Ramesses V, Ramesses VI, through to the final collapse of the New Kingdom around 1070 BCE. Record at least 3 more documented work stoppages, each following the same pattern. Rations arrive late or not at all. Workers leave the Valley of the Kings, sit outside the mortuary temples, demand their overdue payment, receive a partial settlement, return to work, wait for the cycle to begin again. The strike of year 29 had established a precedent, a proven method, a demonstrated technique, a collective tool that the workers of Deir el-Medina now knew how to use, because they had used it before, and it had worked. The first strike begat the second, the third, the fourth. The workers of Deir el-Medina had invented something that would not be named, would not be theorized, would not be consciously recognized as a political innovation for 3,000 years, but something that was, in its essential logic and its essential practice, identical to what workers in every subsequent civilization, from ancient Rome to medieval Europe, to the Industrial Revolution, to the present day, would use to collectively demand what was owed to them. They had discovered the power of collective refusal. They had discovered that labor, withdrawn in unison, creates leverage even against the most absolute authority. They had discovered, without any ideological framework to put it in, the fundamental principle of the labor movement and the man responsible for the administrative collapse that produced the crisis. The man whose failure to ensure the proper functioning of the grain delivery system made the strike of year 29 not just possible, but inevitable, was not the pharaoh Ramesses III himself, who by this point was old and increasingly removed from the daily administration of the state. The villain of the piece, if the surviving records allow us to name one, appears to have been a man named Painab, a foreman of the village who had risen to his position through a combination of ability, political connections, and what the ostraca describe in shocking detail as systematic corruption, theft from the royal tombs, violence against fellow workers, and sexual crimes against the wives and daughters of his colleagues. Painab is one of the most thoroughly documented villains in ancient Egyptian history, not because ancient sources condemned him in grand literary terms, but because his fellow workers and victims filed so many formal complaints against him in such detailed and specific language that his crimes are reconstructible across dozens of surviving documents. He stole tools from the royal tombs. He appropriated royal property. He used his position as foreman to divert rations intended for the workers into his own household. He threatened and physically assaulted workers who complained about him. He was, in the language of our own time, a corrupt union boss, a man who had turned the position of community representative into an instrument of personal enrichment at the expense of the community he was supposed to serve. And the story of Painab, the villain inside the system, the corrupt official whose crimes made the already struggling grain delivery system even less reliable, reminds us that the strike of year 29 was not a simple story of righteous workers against an oppressive state. It was a story of institutional failure at multiple levels simultaneously. A pharaoh whose grip on administration was weakening, officials who were stealing what should have been delivered, a foreman who was diverting what little arrived, and workers at the bottom of the system who received the accumulated consequences of everyone else's failures. It sounds, in every particular, completely and painfully modern. The new kingdom ended not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding institutional collapse that took roughly a century to complete and left Egypt permanently diminished. By the time the last Ramessid pharaoh, Ramesses Xi, died around 1070 BCE without a clear male heir, Egypt had already effectively fractured into two separate political zones. The north, ruled by the vizier turned de facto ruler Harihar and his successors. The south, controlled by the high priests of Amun at Karnak, who had accumulated so much land, so much wealth, and so much political power during the new kingdom that they now rivaled the pharaoh himself in real authority. The third intermediate period that followed 5 centuries of divided authority, Libyan kings, Nubian pharaohs, and Assyrian invasions, saw Egypt reduced from the dominant military and cultural power of the ancient world to a regional player, still respected, still wealthy, still culturally sophisticated, but never again the empire builder that Thutmose III had made it. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina worked on through the early years of the third intermediate period. There are records suggesting the village was still occupied as late as the reign of Ramesses Xi's immediate successor. But eventually, as the royal burial program contracted and the administrative system that funded the village's rations collapsed entirely, Deir el-Medina was abandoned. The craftsmen dispersed, their extraordinary community dissolved, and the Valley of the Kings was sealed and forgotten for the next 3,000 years, except by the tomb robbers who knew exactly where to look and wasted little time in finding it. The pharaohs of the third intermediate period, the Libyan 21st and 22nd dynasties, the Nubian 25th dynasty, the brief Assyrian domination of the late 7th century BCE, ruled Egypt with varying degrees of competence and very little of the cultural ambition that had characterized the new kingdom at its height. The Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, who ruled from around 747 to 656 BCE, were in many ways the most interesting of these transitional rulers, deeply pious Egyptians who had been culturally absorbed into the Egyptian world so thoroughly that they built pyramids in the Sudanese style, restored temples that had fallen into disrepair, and attempted a conscious cultural revival of the Old and Middle Kingdom artistic styles that represents one of history's great acts of archaeological nostalgia. The Nubian pharaoh Taharqa, who ruled from 690 to 664 BCE, built on such a scale and with such ambition that later Egyptians remembered him as one of the great builders of the ancient world. And the Hebrew Bible mentions him as one of the powers that Hezekiah of Judah hoped might help resist the Assyrian expansion under Sennacherib. But the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt in 671 BCE and captured Memphis, and his successor Ashurbanipal sacked Thebes in 663 BCE. The greatest city in the ancient world, the religious capital of Egypt, the home of Karnak and Luxor, and the Valley of the Kings, reduced to plunder, its temples stripped, its population traumatized, the memory of which was so devastating that the Hebrew prophet Nahum used the sack of Thebes as a warning to the city of Nineveh about the impermanence of great powers. The Sate 26th dynasty, which ruled Egypt from around 664 to 525 BCE, under a series of capable pharaohs from the city of Sais in the western delta, represented one last genuine renaissance of Egyptian culture and political autonomy. The pharaoh Psamtik I, who came to power in 664 BCE with Assyrian support, and then gradually freed Egypt from Assyrian influence as that empire overextended itself, and his successors Necho II, Psamtik II Apries, and Amos II, collectively ruled Egypt with a sophistication and a cultural ambition that deliberately evoked the new kingdom at its height. Sate art is among the most technically refined in the entire 3,000-year history of Egyptian civilization. The portraits, in particular, have a quality of psychological realism, of individual specificity that distinguishes them from almost every other period of Egyptian art, and suggests a culture that was deeply, searchingly curious about what it meant to be a human individual in a world of impermanent power. The Sate pharaohs knew they were ruling in the shadow of greater predecessors, and their art reflects this self-consciousness. It is the art of a civilization that has seen its own past and is trying, with enormous skill and genuine passion, to be worthy of it. Yet the Persian Empire, expanding westward under the Achaemenid dynasty, with a speed and organizational efficiency that no ancient state had previously matched, was approaching. And when Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great, marched his army into Egypt in 525 BCE, the Sate pharaoh Psamtik III faced him at the Battle of Pelusium and lost. Egypt became a Persian satrapy, a province of an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. And for the next century and a half, with brief interruptions of native Egyptian rule, Egypt was governed by foreigners for the first time since the Hyksos. The Persians were not, in most respects, bad rulers. Cambyses, despite a reputation for violence built largely on hostile Greek sources, appears to have made genuine efforts to respect Egyptian religious customs, and his successors, Darius I and Xerxes, adopted Egyptian royal titles and supported Egyptian temple construction. But they were foreign, and their foreignness was never forgotten, and the resentment it generated fueled a series of Egyptian revolts. In 404 BCE, native Egyptian pharaohs reclaimed their country for a period of 60 years. Before Alexander the Great marched into Egypt in 332 BCE without encountering significant resistance, and the Egyptians, tired of Persian rule, welcomed him almost as a liberator. Alexander made the pilgrimage to the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis in the western desert, where the priests reportedly confirmed that he was the son of Amun. The divine right to rule Egypt, claimed in the traditional formula, for the last time by a conqueror who knew how to use the past. And with Alexander's conquest, the ancient pharaonic tradition effectively ended, though it would survive in form. Greeks and Romans would wear the pharaoh's double crown, make offerings to the Egyptian gods, and inscribe their names in hieroglyphs on temple walls. For another 6 centuries, until the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Philae in 394 CE, and the 3,000-year tradition of Egyptian sacred writing finally, silently, came to its end. The strike of year 29 was forgotten almost immediately. The Turin strike papyrus survived not because anyone preserved it as a monument to historical significance, but by the random accident of Egyptian climate. The dry desert air of the West Bank preserved organic materials with extraordinary fidelity, leaving behind a record that no European or Mesopotamian culture could have bequeathed to us, because their humid climates rotted organic materials within centuries. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina did not think of themselves as making history. They thought of themselves as demanding grain. When they got some grain, they went back to work, and the event receded into the background noise of administrative records, where it sat for 3,000 years, until a 19th century Egyptologist looked at the Turin papyrus carefully enough to realize what it described. The first labor strike in recorded history was, for most of recorded history, unknown. But the strike's significance does not depend on its being known. Its significance lies in what it demonstrates about the fundamental relationship between labor and power, a relationship that operates by the same basic logic in ancient Egypt, in medieval Europe, in industrial England, in 21st century America. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina discovered, without any theoretical framework, without any political ideology, without any knowledge of what had come before them, or what would come after, that the withdrawal of labor creates leverage, that a worker who stops working has power, that a worker who continues working does not have, because the person who benefits from the work needs it done more than the worker needs any particular employer. This insight, so simple, so obvious once articulated, so invisible before someone actually acts on it, is the foundational principle of every labor movement in history. The union organizers of the 19th century CE rediscovered it independently. The medieval guild members who refused to work without adequate compensation were applying it without knowing its history. Every sit-down strike, every walkout, every general strike, every refusal to cross a picket line in the history of civilization since 1155 BCE is, in some sense, a repetition of what Khans and his colleagues did outside the walls of the mortuary temples on the west bank of Thebes. The language changes, the ideology changes, the cultural context changes beyond recognition. The basic logic does not change. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina also demonstrated something about the relationship between literacy and power that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Their ability to stage effective collective action was significantly enhanced by their literacy. Their ability to read and write meant that they could document the state's failures with precision, file formal written complaints through official channels, keep records that proved when rations had been delivered and when they had not, and communicate among themselves and with the outside administrative world with a sophistication that illiterate workers could not have matched. The scribes of Deir el-Medina were not passive bureaucrats. They were the workers' weapon, the means by which the community turned its knowledge of the state's obligations into leverage against the state. In this sense, the strike of year 29 is also the first documented example of workers using documentation as a tool of collective action, of the written record as an instrument of political pressure, rather than merely an administrative convenience. The papyrus that records the strike was not produced in retrospect by a historian. It was produced in the moment by the worker's own scribe as part of the process of making the strike work. They wrote it down because writing it down made it real, made it official, made it part of the record that the officials on the other side of the wall could not easily deny or dismiss. The other legacy of Deir el-Medina that deserves attention is what the community's records reveal about the lives of ordinary people in the ancient world. The tens of thousands of ostraca and papyri from Deir el-Medina have given historians something extraordinarily rare: a genuinely three-dimensional view of ancient life, not filtered through the ideological distortions of official royal propaganda or religious literature, but captured in the quotidian detail of daily administrative record-keeping and casual personal communication. We know that a painter named Userhat was chronically absent from work, and that his colleagues were irritated about it. We know that a woman named Nonakut loved some of her children more than others, and was not shy about saying so. We know that the people of Deir el-Medina were afraid of ghosts. Their letters to dead relatives asking for help with earthly problems are among the most emotionally affecting documents from the ancient world, and that they also found time between carving the most sacred images in the Egyptian universe to write erotic poetry of considerable wit and frankness. We know that they argued about money, helped each other in illness, celebrated births, and mourned deaths, conducted elaborate disputes about property that lasted for generations, and occasionally, when the system that was supposed to support them failed badly enough, did something about it. The people of Deir el-Medina were not symbols or abstractions or illustrations of historical forces. They were human beings, as complex and contradictory and alive as any human beings who have ever existed. And the accident of climate that preserved their records has given us the extraordinary privilege of knowing them as individuals across the gulf of 3 millennia. The strike of year 29 was not, as sometimes presented in popular accounts, a completely isolated event without precedent or parallel in the ancient world. The ancient world contained many forms of what we might today call labor resistance. Some documented, most inferred, all reflecting the same fundamental dynamic that produced the Deir el-Medina strike. In Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi, compiled around 1754 BCE, 3 centuries before the Deir el-Medina strike, contained provisions regulating the wages of workers in various trades, suggesting that disputes over compensation were sufficiently common to require legal codification. The clay tablets of ancient Sumer and Akkad contain administrative records that, carefully reveal moments of collective work stoppage or organized refusal that prefigure what happened at Deir el-Medina. Though none as clearly documented or as explicitly recorded as a deliberate collective action. In ancient Greece, the institution of the craft guild, while not identical to a labor union, gave skilled workers a degree of collective identity and bargaining capacity that occasionally manifested in what we would recognize as collective bargaining. In Rome, the collegium, associations of workers in particular trades, had complex and contested relationships with the state, sometimes functioning as little more than social clubs, sometimes wielding enough collective economic power to force employers into negotiation. But none of these parallels produced a document as clear, as specific, and as unmistakably a labor action as the Turin strike papyrus. None of them left behind a written record that said, in the unambiguous language of administrative fact, these workers on this date walked off this job and stated these specific demands, and the authorities responded in this specific way. The Turin strike papyrus is unique not because it describes the only ancient labor action. It almost certainly does not, but because it describes one in enough detail that we can reconstruct what happened with confidence. It is a primary source in the most literal sense, a document produced by participants in an event that describes that event as it was happening, without the distortions of subsequent literary reworking or ideological filtering. Reading it is as close as it is possible to get to being present at the moment when the first strike occurred. And being present at that moment reveals that it was simultaneously extraordinary and ordinary. Extraordinary because nothing like it had ever been written down before. Ordinary because what the workers were asking for was not revolutionary demands, but simply what they had been promised. The implications of the Deir el-Medina strike for our understanding of ancient Egyptian society are profound and still being worked through by scholars. The dominant image of ancient Egypt in popular culture, a civilization of god-kings with absolute power over a helpless, passive, servile population, is not so much wrong as it is incomplete. The pharaoh's authority was real, enormous, and structurally unchallenged in ways that no modern government can match. But authority does not exist in a vacuum. It depends, even at its most absolute, on the functioning of the systems that translate power into practical reality. And when those systems fail, the gap between the pharaoh's theoretical omnipotence and his actual ability to deliver on the implicit contract between ruler and subject becomes visible. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina did not challenge the pharaoh's authority. They exposed its limit, the limit that every authority system in history eventually encounters, the point at which the people who do the essential work decide that the cost of doing it exceeds the benefit of receiving whatever the authority is providing in return. This is not, at its root, a political question. It is a human question, a question about the threshold at which ordinary people, who have nothing but their labor and their solidarity, decide that enough is enough. The answer that the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina gave to that question, the answer of walking out, sitting down, speaking demands clearly and publicly, and holding together until something changed, has echoed through 3,000 years of human history with a persistence that suggests it is not a culturally specific response, but something closer to a universal one. Wherever human beings have been organized into systems of labor, wherever the delivery of promised compensation has failed, wherever the gap between the power of the employer and the vulnerability of the worker has seemed too wide to bridge by any other means, in those places and in those moments, people have discovered over and over again what the workers of Deir el-Medina discovered in year 29 of Ramesses III. They have put down their tools and refused to pick them up again until something changed. The physical remains of Deir el-Medina are among the best preserved and most extensively excavated ancient settlements in the world. The village site was first systematically excavated by the Italian Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli between 1905 and 1909, who discovered the intact tomb of a craftsman named Ka and his wife Merit. A burial so complete and so well preserved that it contained not just the coffins and mummies of the couple, but their everyday household objects, furniture, clothing, cosmetics, tools, food offerings, and personal items that give a vivid and immediate sense of what life in the village actually looked and felt like. Ka's tomb is now displayed almost entirely in the Museo Egizio in Turin, the same institution that houses the Turin strike papyrus, creating an extraordinary convergence of artifacts that together tell the story of Deir el-Medina's people with more completeness than almost any other ancient community outside of Pompeii. The most extensive excavations of Deir el-Medina were conducted by the French Egyptologist Bernard Breyer between 1917 and 1947. 30 years of systematic excavation that uncovered the village's houses, its cemeteries, its wells, its rubbish dumps, which proved unexpectedly valuable since the villagers threw their used ostraca away, and the rubbish dumps preserved them in enormous quantities, and its subsidiary structures, including a small temple to the goddess Hathor, and a number of workers' chapels decorated with paintings of considerable artistic sophistication. Breyer's excavations produced the primary corpus of ostraca and papyri that form the documentary foundation of everything historians know about the people of Deir el-Medina. A corpus that now runs to tens of thousands of individual documents scattered across museums and private collections across the world, and that continues to be studied, translated, and interpreted by a community of scholars whose collective effort represents one of the most sustained acts of historical recovery in the history of Egyptology. The people of Deir el-Medina threw away their notes, their receipts, their rough drafts, and casual jottings on broken pottery and limestone chips. And 3,000 years later, historians picked them out of the sand and learned to read them, and the voices of the dead came back. The houses of Deir el-Medina tell their own story. The village was originally laid out in a single row of houses along a central street, enclosed within a perimeter wall, with the houses of the foremen at the northern end of the village, near the gate. Over time, additional houses were built outside the wall as the community grew, and the original layout was modified and expanded in ways that track the village's changing demographics across the generations. Each house followed the same basic plan: a reception room, a main living area, a bedroom, a cellar, and a rooftop work area where many daily activities took place in the shade of reed matting. But the decoration of individual houses varied considerably, reflecting the personal tastes and economic means of their occupants. The houses of the more prosperous craftsmen, the foremen, the senior draftsmen, the scribes, were decorated with painted walls, sometimes featuring images of the gods that the family particularly favored, sometimes showing scenes of daily life, sometimes incorporating votive stele inscribed with prayers and hymns that reflect the intensely personal religious life of the community. Deir el-Medina was not merely a workers' camp. It was a community with all the complexity, hierarchy, individuality, and internal politics that the word implies. And the physical remains of the village make this complexity tangible in a way that written records alone cannot. The tombs of Deir el-Medina are, if anything, even more remarkable than the village itself. The craftsmen who carved and painted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings did not confine their artistic abilities to their official work. They applied the same skills, the same color sense, the same narrative sophistication to the decoration of their own tombs, which they built and decorated themselves in the hillsides surrounding the village during their off days and rest periods. The painted tombs of Deir el-Medina, particularly those of the draftsmen Sennajem in Herkau and Ipai and the foreman Pashadu, are among the finest painted tombs anywhere in the Theban necropolis, showing not just the standard scenes of the Book of the Dead and the afterlife journey, but also vivid, detailed, sometimes surprisingly intimate scenes of daily life and work that give historians an unparalleled visual record of what these people looked like, how they dressed, what tools they used, and how they moved through their physical world. The tomb of Sennajem in particular, discovered intact in 1886, and now largely in the Cairo Museum, contains a famous painting of Sennajem and his wife Enferti working in the fields of Iru, the Egyptian paradise where the crops grow without effort and the grain is always full, an image that manages to be simultaneously a religious statement about the afterlife and a deeply personal expression of what a craftsman who spent his entire working life in service of others' eternal comfort hoped his own eternity might look like. He wanted to farm. He wanted to work with his wife beside him. He wanted grain. To fully understand why the strike of year 29 happened when it did, and not earlier, it is necessary to understand the specific administrative context of the late reign of Ramesses III, a context that was, in every measurable dimension, one of institutional dysfunction at the highest levels of the Egyptian state. The 29th year of Ramesses III's reign was not an ordinary year. It was a year in which the pharaoh himself was embroiled in a succession crisis of extraordinary bitterness, in which the harem conspiracy that would eventually cost him his life, and which CT scanning of his mummy in 2012 confirmed was ultimately successful, was either in progress or had recently occurred. The court was consumed with internal political maneuvering. The vizierial administration, which was responsible for overseeing the delivery of rations to Deir el-Medina, was distracted by the crisis at the top of the state, and the regional granary officials who actually managed the physical delivery of grain to the West Bank workers were, based on the surviving evidence, either incompetent corrupt, or both. The specific officials named in the Deir el-Medina strike records as responsible for the ration failures include a man called Montumos, who appears to have been the chief administrator of the West Bank granary system, and who appears in multiple complaint documents as the primary target of the workers' frustration. Montumos was apparently well aware of the ration shortfalls. The complaint letters were filed with and through his office, but was either unwilling or unable to address them from his own resources, and was either failing to pass the complaints upward to the vizier, or was having those complaints ignored when he did. The systemic nature of the failure is clear from the fact that multiple consecutive months of rations went undelivered. This was not a one-time administrative error, but a sustained failure that someone at the managerial level was aware of and had not solved. Whether Montumos was personally corrupt, diverting the grain to his own benefit, or simply administratively overwhelmed and politically outmaneuvered in the scramble for resources that characterized the late Ramessid state, is not definitively answerable from the surviving records. What is answerable is that the system failed, people went hungry, and nobody in authority took effective corrective action until the workers forced the issue themselves. The broader context of Egyptian administrative decay in the post-Ramesses III period is documented across multiple archaeological and textual sources. The Great Papyrus Harris, a document over 40 meters long that was compiled at the beginning of the reign of Ramesses IV, and records the vast pious donations that Ramesses III claimed to have made to the temples during his reign, gives a sense of the extraordinary concentration of wealth in the temple institutions of the New Kingdom at this late stage. By the end of Ramesses III's reign, the temples of Egypt, particularly the great temple complex of Amun at Karnak, controlled an estimated 30% of Egypt's agricultural land and owned enormous flocks of cattle, quantities of gold and silver, and administrative staffs that rivaled the royal bureaucracy in size and sophistication. The temple institutions were not simply religious centers. They were economic powerhouses, and their increasing wealth and institutional independence created a structural problem that no Ramessid pharaoh had successfully resolved. The more resources flowed into the temple system, the fewer resources were available to the royal administration for functions like paying the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina. The workers' grain rations were, in the final analysis, a victim of a long-term structural imbalance between the temple economy and the royal economy that had been building for generations, and that no short-term administrative fix could address. The strike of year 29 was the symptom of a disease that was slowly killing the New Kingdom state from the inside. A disease of institutional inertia, political fragmentation, and administrative corruption that would, within a century and a half, destroy the 3,000-year-old structure of pharaonic Egypt itself. One of the most striking features of the Turin strike papyrus, when read carefully in translation, is the way in which it humanizes the people involved in the dispute. This is not a document written to be literature. It is not written to be read by posterity. It is an administrative record written in the practical, unadorned language of Egyptian bureaucratic communication. And precisely because of this, it captures something that more deliberate literary compositions often miss: the texture of real human speech, the specific language of specific people in specific circumstances, the way that people actually talk when they are frightened and angry, and trying to hold themselves and their community together. The workers demand, "We are hungry and thirsty. We have no clothing, no ointment, no fish, no vegetables. Write to our lord the Pharaoh about it," is not rhetoric. It is not a political manifesto. It is the voice of people who are describing their actual situation in the most direct terms available to them, and who have decided that the only way to make that situation audible to the people with power over it is to go somewhere that cannot be ignored and say it out loud. The foreman Khans, who appears to have been the primary leader of the year 29 strike, is known from other Deir el-Medina records as well as the strike papyrus. He was a real person with a documented career in the village, a man of considerable ability and political savvy, who navigated the complex social terrain of the West Bank administrative world with skill. The scribes who wrote the papyrus that records the strike were themselves craftsmen. The village scribes were not external bureaucrats, but members of the Deir el-Medina community, men who had grown up in the village, whose families were part of the same social network as the men they were recording. When they wrote down the workers' demands, they were writing about their neighbors, their relatives, their friends. When they filed the formal complaints with the vizier's office, they were simultaneously doing their administrative job and participating in the collective action of their community. The personal and the professional, the individual and the collective, the administrative and the political were all mixed together in the small, intensely social world of the village in ways that make it impossible to separate them. And the papyrus reflects this mixing in the way it moves fluidly between formal administrative language and the vivid, direct speech of individuals under stress. Other figures who appear in the strike records include a man named Hay, one of the deputy foremen, who appears to have been active in organizing the workers' collective action alongside Khans, and several scribes whose names appear in the complaint documents filed during and after the strike. The officials on the other side, the temple administrators who came out to negotiate with the workers, the vizier's representatives who eventually arranged the emergency ration deliveries, are less fully individualized in the surviving records, appearing primarily as functions rather than persons. But they, too, were real people, doing a genuinely difficult job under genuinely difficult circumstances, trying to manage a crisis that their institutional tools had never been designed to handle. In the context of a state that was under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, the history of the Deir el-Medina strike is not a morality play with heroes and villains. It is the history of a system under stress, and the people inside that system doing their best, some better than others, some much worse than others, to navigate the pressure points where the system was failing. The craftsmen who staged the first recorded strike in history were not merely workers in the narrow, economistic sense that the word sometimes implies. They were artists of the highest order, people who spent their working days surrounded by images of extraordinary beauty, creating those images themselves, living inside a visual world of a richness and complexity that would not be surpassed in human art for over 2,000 years. The New Kingdom tomb paintings that the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina produced are not just historically significant. They are genuinely, aesthetically magnificent images of such color, such dynamism, such narrative sophistication that they retain the power to move a viewer who knows nothing about their historical context and simply responds to them as visual experience. The artists who painted these images were not mechanically reproducing conventional patterns. They were making choices about composition, about color, about the relationship between figures and space, about how to represent movement and depth within the constraints of the two-dimensional surface that reflect genuine artistic intelligence and genuine aesthetic feeling. The tomb of Nebamun, whose painted fragments are now in the British Museum, shows a hunting scene in a papyrus marsh of such vitality and naturalistic observation. The fish darting in the water, the birds exploding from the reeds, the cat catching a bird with a kind of predatory intelligence that no formula could have produced, that it stands as one of the greatest paintings of the ancient world by any standard of comparison. The religious world of the craftsmen was equally rich and personal. The ostraca of Deir el-Medina include numerous texts that reflect a private religious practice of considerable intensity. Hymns to the gods composed by individual workers, votive inscriptions recording personal prayers and their answers, letters to dead relatives asking for their intercession in matters of health, legal disputes, and family relationships. The personal prayers from Deir el-Medina represent one of the most intimate windows into ancient Egyptian religious life that we possess, a contrast with the official temple rituals and royal religious literature that shows a dimension of Egyptian faith that the official sources largely suppress. The experience of the individual believer who prays not for the pharaoh's victory in battle or the flood's proper timing, but for relief from a toothache or success in a dispute with a neighbor or the safe delivery of a child. The gods of Deir el-Medina included not just the great state deities, Amun, Ra, Osiris, Hathor, but also local and personal deities of particular significance to the community, including the deified form of Amenhotep I, the pharaoh who had traditionally founded the village, who was worshipped as a patron deity and oracle of Deir el-Medina long after his death. His statue carried in procession during festivals and consulted by villagers seeking divine guidance on personal and communal decisions. The village also had a sophisticated tradition of what Egyptologists call personal piety, a form of religious practice that emerged strongly in the New Kingdom, and that placed the individual's direct relationship with a chosen deity at the center of religious life, somewhat in contrast to the temple cult's emphasis on institutional ritual mediated by professional priests. A painter named Neferabu, who lived in Deir el-Medina sometime during the 19th or 20th dynasty, left a votive stele in which he described how he had committed a sin, apparently perjury, and been punished with blindness by the goddess Meretseger, who protected the Theban necropolis, and then healed by the same goddess after he confessed and repented. The stele is one of the earliest known confessional texts in the history of religion, a document in which an individual publicly acknowledges wrongdoing, seeks divine forgiveness, and witnesses to others that the God's justice is real and personal. The craftsmen of Deir el-Medina were, in their religious life, as in their professional life, doing things that had never been done before in quite the same way. And the fact that they were also, in their political life, doing something that had never been done before in quite the same way begins to seem less like a coincidence and more like a pattern. These were people who had an unusually well-developed sense of themselves as individuals with rights, obligations, and relationships with their gods, with their employers, with their community, and who were capable of acting on that sense in ways that others, more constrained by social position or illiteracy or simple fear, could not. Any full account of the Deir el-Medina community must acknowledge the women of the village, whose presence in the surviving records, while less extensive than that of the men, is sufficient to establish them as active, assertive, economically engaged participants in community life in ways that were unusual in the ancient world, and that add another dimension to the story of the strike of year 29. Women in Egyptian law had rights that their counterparts in most ancient societies did not possess. They could own property, conduct legal transactions, file complaints before the village court, and appear as witnesses in legal proceedings. The women of Deir el-Medina exercised these rights extensively, as the surviving records make clear. They bought and sold goods. They lent money. They litigated disputes over property with the same tenacity as their male neighbors. A woman named Irenafer appears in multiple documents as a businesswoman of considerable activity, engaged in transactions involving grain, clothing, and other goods that suggest she ran an independent economic operation alongside whatever household duties she performed. Another woman, Hunero, appears in the village attendance records as absent from work on multiple occasions, a reference that has puzzled some historians, since women did not officially work in the Valley of the Kings, but which may refer to work done within the village itself, perhaps in the preparation of food or other services that supported the male workers' operations. The most famous woman of Deir el-Medina is nomadic, whose will, dating to the reign of Ramesses V, around 1145 BCE, survives in two versions and documents her deliberate disinheritance of several of her children in terms of unmistakable personal feeling. Nomadic had been married twice, first to a scribe named Kenna, with whom she had no children, and then to a craftsman named Kaimnun, with whom she had 8 children. By the time she made her will, she was evidently elderly, and she had decided that some of her children had cared for her adequately in her old age, and some had not. To the ones who had not, she left nothing. And she said so clearly, in writing, in a legal document witnessed by members of the village court. "I am a free woman of Egypt," she declared in the opening of her will, a formulation that asserts her legal personhood and her right to dispose of her property as she chose. "I have brought up 8 children and have provided them with everything suitable to their station in life. But now I have grown old, and behold, they are not looking after me in my turn. Whoever of them has aided me, to him I will give of my property. He who has not aided me, to him I will give nothing of my property." Nomnac's voice, emerging from this document across 3,000 years, is one of the most vivid individual voices in the ancient world, specific, personal, emotionally complex, and entirely recognizable as the voice of a particular person with a particular history and a particular set of feelings about that history. She was not a symbol. She was non-accurate, and she was angry, and she had a quill and a papyrus and the legal right to say so. The women of Deir el-Medina did not participate directly in the strike of year 29. The surviving records describe the action as taken by the male craftsmen and organized by the male foreman, but the strike could not have been sustained without the tacit or explicit support of the village community as a whole, including its women, who managed household resources, maintained social networks, and provided the domestic infrastructure within which the collective action of the male workers was organized and sustained. The women of Deir el-Medina knew, as well as their husbands and fathers and sons, that the grain was not arriving. They felt the hunger in their own bodies and in the bodies of their children. The decision to strike was made by the men who had official status as workers in the valley. But it was made in a community context that the women shaped, and the women's willingness to support the action, or at least not to undermine it, was part of what made it possible. The Egypt that the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina would have recognized, the Egypt of the pharaohs, the Valley of the Kings, the great temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, ended as a living political entity with the Arab conquest of 641 CE, when the army of the Rashidun Caliphate under Amr ibn al-As marched into Alexandria and completed one of the most consequential cultural transformations in human history, converting the last Roman province of Egypt into the first Muslim one. The 3,000-year tradition of the pharaonic state was long dead by then. It had been succeeded by the Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty, then by the Roman Empire, then by the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. But the Arab conquest completed a transformation that those earlier conquests had not. It changed the language, the religion, and the cultural orientation of the Egyptian people so thoroughly that the hieroglyphic writing of the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina became, within a few centuries, a completely undeciphered script whose very existence testified to a civilization that the new Egypt could not read, the Egypt of the 19th and 20th centuries, colonized by France at the end of the 18th century under Napoleon, ruled by the Muhammad Ali dynasty as an Ottoman client state that became effectively a British protectorate struggling for independence under Orabi Pasha, and then the Waft Party, and then the officers who overthrew the monarchy in 1952. Reconnected with its ancient past, not through cultural continuity, but through the discoveries of archaeologists and the decipherment of hieroglyphics by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, who used the Rosetta Stone, a decree issued in 3 scripts by the Ptolemaic pharaoh Ptolemy V in 196 BCE, to crack the code that had sealed the ancient Egyptians behind 3,000 years of silence. Champollion's decipherment was the moment when the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina got their voices back, when the Turin strike papyrus became readable, when Nanak could speak again, when the Foreman Khans could once more tell the story of the day he led his people out of the valley and sat down outside the temple walls and demanded grain. Gamal Abdel Nasser, who seized power in Egypt in 1952 and became the dominant political figure of the Arab world in the mid-20th century, understood this reconnection in political terms. He used the image of ancient Egypt's greatness as a nationalist resource, evoking the independence and cultural achievement of the pharaonic past to argue that Egypt deserved sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination in the present, that the people who had built the pyramids and the Valley of the Kings should not be subject to British military bases or French control of the Suez Canal. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956 and faced the combined military power of Britain, France, and Israel, and faced them down with American diplomatic pressure forcing a humiliating withdrawal. It was, in a sense, the latest iteration of an ancient Egyptian tradition, a people who had been told they owed service to a greater power, deciding that enough was enough. Egypt today, the Arab Republic of Egypt, governed since 2014 by President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, home to over 105 million people, the most populous country in the Arab world, and one of the most strategically important in the global system, stands at another of those hinge moments that recur throughout its history, when the gap between what the state promises and what it delivers becomes visible to the people who live beneath it. The grand temples are now tourist attractions, their paint faded to ghost images of the vivid colors that Deir el-Medina craftsmen once applied with such care. The Valley of the Kings receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year who walk through the tombs of Ramesses III and Tutankhamun, and the lesser-known burial chambers of officials whose names most tourists cannot read, standing in the same corridors that Khan's and his colleagues carved and decorated, breathing the same dry desert air that preserved the papyri that tell their story. The grain deliveries that the workers of Deir el-Medina demanded are long gone, replaced by bread subsidies and fuel subsidies, and a complex system of state support that, in its structure if not its form, reflects the same fundamental social contract that the ancient state maintained with its skilled workers. You serve the state's purposes, and the state ensures your survival. When that contract holds, the tombs get carved, the trains run on time, the monuments endure. When it fails, when the grain does not arrive, when the ration deliveries are diverted by corruption, when the officials responsible for delivery are too distracted or too compromised to do their jobs, the people who depend on that contract have shown, across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, that they know what to do. They put down their tools and they wait, and they do not pick those tools back up until something changes. And the question of whether Egypt's current social contract can endure, whether the men and women who today depend on the state for their daily bread will continue to receive what has been promised, remains, as it has always remained in this ancient and astonishing land, genuinely and urgently unresolved.